On the one hand, you had three different factions of the Iraqi elites whose interests were aligned with transnational interests and the US occupation by extension. So on the one hand, you had an opportunity, you had things that were happening within the Iraqi elites. And on the other hand, and this is neoliberalism taking advantage of that, you had the strategy of neoliberal development that was able to take advantage of the opportunity and to bring these different factions together into a historic bloc. To give you an idea of what I mean and why I refer to these groups as an unlikely alliance, consider who makes up this bloc. So I'm going to give you four groups. There's the Kurdish Alliance, a secular grouping demanding autonomy for the northern part of Iraq. Then there is the Dawah Party and the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. They were both religious Shia party. The Supreme Council was and is close to Iran, and for a time wanted an autonomous Shia region in southern part of Iraq. Then the third group is the Iraqi National Accord, a secular organization sympathetic to Sunni groups. And finally, you have the Association of Muslim Scholars, a religious Sunni party that opposed the Kurdish region and demanded a strong central government in Baghdad. So these groups, as I hope it's obvious, they were very different from each other. It was these very differences that most pundits and scholars pointed to as the fault lines within the Iraqi political landscape. It's what Joe Biden kept using to push for his ridiculous idea that we needed to split Iraq into three pieces, as if he was the godfather of Iraq. Yet, all these groups came together around the neoliberal project for Iraq, despite their strong disagreements over religious, social, cultural matters, political orientation, and distinct histories and social bases. They were indeed an unlikely alliance. These different parties, despite their strong disagreements, had factions within them that were favorable to the transnational agenda. And I categorized three different factions that I'm going to go through. And then you're going to see how the neoliberal strategy was able to use these three fractions to bring together this bloc. The first one was an emergent Iraqi transnational oriented class. The CPA fostered this group that promoted neoliberalism based on its own material interests. Initially, as I mentioned, the CPA's shock program of economic reforms drove the nationally oriented capitalists out of business if they were not able to adapt to the emerging transnational economic framework or strategy that was coming in. Those that foresaw the transformation from nationally to transnationally oriented accumulation and who possessed the economic and political capital to take advantage of this shift were able to profit from the change and emerged as members of the new transnationally oriented class fraction. A significant group that made up this fraction was the Iraqi expatriates, like myself, who poured into Iraq right after the invasion. They used their knowledge of Iraq to position themselves as intermediaries between Iraq and foreign business interests seeking to penetrate the country. The second group was the Kurdish elite, who were also a significant part of this emerging transnationally oriented elites. The Kurdish region saw the least amount of turmoil relative to the rest of Iraq after the invasion. The relative strength of the Kurdish regional state apparatus made it more conducive to investment and the proliferation of a private sector. So the region became kind of a gateway for transnational businesses to come into Iraq. They built up all their offices in the north, and they would go into Iraq. And the Kurdish parties became the main proponents in Baghdad of an economic integrationist policy. So that's the first group. The second faction, was made up of those who were politically dependent on the occupation. This group is best represented by some within the Dawah Party and the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution that I had mentioned earlier. These groups had, originally campaigned against the Ba'ath regime for over 2 decades. They were supportive of the invasion and the overthrow of Saddam's regime. But during the occupation, these groups attempted to position themselves favorably vis-a-vis the U.S. forces in hopes of getting better positions within the government. They depended on the occupation regime's military and diplomatic backing for their own domestic political ambitions. In general, the less credibility that you had in the street, the more dependent you were on the occupation forces. And so this political dependence became a reason to acquiesce to neoliberal policies. I'm going to jump real quick. The third group were technopoles. Technopoles are technocrats turned politicians. It was a term that Jorge Dominguez originally came up with, and Robinson expanded on, and he talks about them as policy-oriented teams that colonize key ministries and government departments upon coming to power. And they're technically skilled and politically savvy leaders who position themselves during critical periods of change. I'm going to give you some examples. You had Ali Alawi. He was Harvard-educated business in the business school. He became the finance minister. Hussein al-Shahristani. He's a physicist who became the minister of oil. You have Tariq al-Shafiqi, a long-time member of the energy sector who became really high up in drafting the oil law in Iraq. You had Sinan al-Shabibi, a trained economist who's now the governor of the Central Bank of Iraq. So these guys, because they were supposedly technocrats, people thought that they're honest brokers, and so they gave them the benefit of the doubt in that sense. So what the neoliberal strategy was, and the way that it brought these folks together, was to focus on the economics rather than political or cultural matters. And that way was able to fuse these different factions within the different parties together and not get entangled in the political or cultural battles that would otherwise fill these parties. And so they brought them together and created a neoliberal historic bloc. So that was the first one.